Veronica Hayes had spent nearly an hour on the road, the hum of her black sedan a soft lull in the quiet night. The high beams cut through the darkness as the stretch of highway seemed to stretch endlessly, the flicker of streetlights offering little comfort. As the newly appointed director of the FBI, long hours were a constant companion, the weight of her responsibilities heavy on her shoulders. She had just left a classified briefing that would shape the direction of the agency for months to come. The briefing was filled with secrets, strategies, and a constant reminder of the stakes, each decision a thread woven into the complex fabric of national security. But it wasn't the classified briefing or fatigue that was on her mind as the miles passed by. It was a feeling of being pulled into a web of tension she hadn't expected. The road was nearly empty, just her car and the occasional flicker of a distant headlight. She barely noticed a police cruiser trailing her until the sudden flash of red and blue lights illuminated her rear-view mirror. Veronica's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, the speedometer clearly showing she was doing exactly 65 miles per hour, right on the mark. She exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. There was no reason for the stop, no sudden swerves or reckless driving. Years of experience working alongside law enforcement told her this wasn't routine. Yet, the cruiser remained behind her, the sirens flashing louder in her ears. She steered her car to the shoulder, a slight sense of unease creeping in. It wasn't the flashing lights, but the way this officer moved. Too deliberate, too slow. Something felt off. Something about this moment told her it was not just a routine traffic stop. And in the pit of her stomach, Veronica knew tonight would be anything but ordinary. The officer took his time, too much time. As Veronica sat there, the moment stretched out like eternity. She could feel the tension mounting, her pulse steady but her mind racing through all the possible reasons for this delay. Something about this felt wrong. There was no reason for this stop, no sudden movements, no erratic driving, and yet the cruiser remained behind her. The lights danced across her rearview mirror like some twisted strobe light, adding to the growing sense of unease. She knew the protocol, the drill. She had been on the other side of countless traffic stops, working hand in hand with law enforcement officers. But none of those stops had ever felt like this. Veronica glanced in the side mirror, trying to catch a glimpse of the officer. She adjusted it slightly, just enough to catch sight of him as he finally opened the door to his cruiser. The man who stepped out was unfamiliar, his uniform different from the officers she usually worked with. He was tall, his posture rigid and stiff, almost aggressive. He moved slowly, but his every step exuded a kind of tension, like a predator circling its prey. His hand hovered near his firearm as he approached, and the sharp beam of his flashlight cut through the night, shining into her face, momentarily blinding her. She felt a surge of frustration, but she kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Stay calm," she told herself. "You've handled far worse than this." "Evening, officer," she said, her voice steady, controlled, but she could sense something was off in the way he looked at her. There was no greeting, no reason for the stop, just a cold demand for her license and registration. "Why?" she thought. "Why am I being pulled over?" The officer's response was nothing short of bizarre. There was no friendly greeting, no small talk, just a direct, almost mechanical order to hand over her license and registration. Veronica had dealt with her fair share of tough, no-nonsense officers, but this felt different. It was like the man had been trained to be deliberately difficult. She almost half-smiled, as if she were in the middle of some bizarre, low-budget crime show where the bad cop played his role a little too well. "License. Registration," he repeated, chewing his gum slowly, his eyes narrowing on her as though she were a suspect, not the FBI director. She raised an eyebrow, her patience beginning to wear thin. She worked alongside law enforcement for years, decades, in fact, and not once had she encountered a cop like this. Was he trying to prove something? Or was he just in over his head? She leaned forward, her fingers reaching for her purse on the passenger seat. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she asked, her voice calm but now tinged with a hint of curiosity. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he just chewed his gum a little louder, glancing at her credentials as if they were irrelevant. He didn't even flinch when she handed them over, showing him both her FBI ID and her driver's license, which she held out with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. The second his eyes landed on her badge, Veronica saw it. A flicker of recognition, then a shift. He was trying to decide if he should back off or double down. FBI, huh? He said, his voice dropping to a low, mocking tone. Veronica leaned back in her seat, her fingers still tightly gripping the steering wheel. Yes, sir, she replied, giving him a look that might as well have been a challenge. The silence between them was thick, as though the officer was mentally weighing the consequences of his next move. Veronica had been in countless high-stakes situations, negotiating with international criminals and domestic terrorists. But this felt more like a bad sitcom, one where the plot twisted unexpectedly and everyone forgot their lines. She could almost picture it, the camera zooming in on her perfectly composed face, while the officer, caught in the ridiculousness of the moment, fumbled for a response. And then it happened. The officer's expression shifted from one of detached authority to something far more personal. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice sharp, as if he were delivering the punchline to a joke only he understood. Veronica blinked, almost as if she were waiting for a laugh track to kick in. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice light, but laced with a touch of disbelief. She had heard that phrase 1,000 times during interrogations, but this was different. This wasn't a criminal suspect. This was her, and she had done nothing wrong. The officer took a half step back, his hand twitching toward his holster, as though this was some twisted power play. "Step out," he repeated, this time with a little more emphasis. Veronica's mind raced. She could feel the tension building in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. No! This officer had his own agenda, one that had nothing to do with enforcing the law. But she wasn't about to let him get away with it. With deliberate slowness, she leaned forward and grabbed the door handle, her eyes locked on his. "Sir, I'm not getting out of this car without a valid reason," she said, her tone firm. She wasn't playing the game he thought he was playing. If he wanted to push, she was ready to push back. The officer's silence spoke volumes. Veronica could feel his gaze boring into her, his jaw set in a hard line, as if he were trying to figure out how much further he could push. The tension in the air was thick enough to make her skin prickle. She'd been in standoff before, long hours in negotiation rooms, facing off with people far more dangerous than this officer. But this was a whole new level of absurdity. For a moment, Veronica considered the possibility that this was some sort of test. Was he trying to rattle her? See if he could get a rise out of her? She had been through too much in her career to be intimidated by some random cop playing power games on a lonely stretch of highway in Arizona. She had dealt with international crises, criminal masterminds, and terrorists who had nothing but contempt for authority. She had survived all of that. She wasn't about to let some small-town officer turn her into a headline for the wrong reasons. "Look, I'm just reaching for my purse," Veronica said, her voice calm, but with an undercurrent of firmness that was impossible to ignore. She wanted to make sure that her movements were clear, deliberate, non-threatening. She wasn't about to let this turn into a confrontation. The officer didn't budge. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, his hand still hovering near his gun. "Hand me your license and registration," he demanded again, voice low, but there was something almost triumphant in it. Veronica bit back a sigh. This was ridiculous. Was this how things had become now? Had he forgotten that she was FBI? That she had more experience with the law than he'd ever dreamed of? But instead of firing back with sharp retort, she simply took a deep breath. "I'm doing exactly what you asked. But you're not following the law, officer." There it was, the first hint of doubt, just enough to let her know that maybe, just maybe, she could turn this around. Veronica's patience was beginning to fray, and she could sense a shift in the officer's demeanor. The tension in the air had thickened into something almost palpable, like the calm before a storm. He was no longer pretending to follow protocol. No, this was about something deeper, a struggle for power. The officer, whose name she still didn't know, had a point to prove, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he was willing to go to any lengths to get there. It was like watching a toddler throw a tantrum, only with a badge and a gun. Veronica's hands remained visible on the steering wheel, but she could feel her grip tightening, her fingers flexing as though preparing for an impending confrontation. She had dealt with difficult men before, had faced down cartel leaders, domestic terrorists, and rogue agents. But this was different. This was a man who had mistaken authority for dominance, who thought that a uniform and a gun made him untouchable. She could see it in his eyes, the raw hunger for control. "Step out of the car," he repeated, this time with a voice that carried a dangerous edge. He took a half step forward, his hand once again hovering near his weapon. The flashlight in his other hand flickered in the night, the beam dancing over her face in an almost mocking rhythm. For a split second, Veronica thought about playing it his way, just stepping out of the car, complying, giving him the satisfaction of thinking he had won. But then she realized that was exactly what he wanted, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of having the upper hand. Her voice was as calm and measured as it had been before. "On what grounds, officer?" she asked, a subtle challenge in her words. The officer's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Instead, he took another step closer, pushing her further into the corner, testing how far he could go. Veronica didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "You're making a mistake." And that was when she saw it, the hesitation, a brief moment of doubt. And that was exactly what she had been waiting for. Just as Veronica was beginning to feel the weight of the situation settle like a thick fog around her, she heard it, a voice, sharp and cutting through the tension. "Hey, I'm recording this." The words rang out from the edge of the road, louder than any siren, a sudden jolt of reality. It was like someone had pulled the curtain back on the little drama the officer thought he was directing, exposing him for what he was, a man who thought he could bend the rules and get away with it. Veronica's heart skipped a beat as she glanced toward the source of the voice. A man stood there, phone raised, the screen casting a faint glow against his face. He wasn't close enough to intervene, but he was close enough to capture everything. His voice had the power of a witness, and witnesses? They were the game changers. The officer, who had been acting as if he could control the situation with nothing but his bad attitude and badge, now had to contend with something far more dangerous than Veronica's calm composure. A camera. Kearns, the officer, flinched just a bit, his gaze darting to the witness before quickly looking back at Veronica. It was a shift, subtle but telling. The arrogance he had worn like a suit suddenly seemed thinner, more fragile, as though he could already feel the walls closing in. "Is this really how you want to play this?" Veronica asked, her tone laced with quiet satisfaction. The shift in power was palpable. The officer's grip on his flashlight faltered, and for the briefest of moments, Veronica could see it in his eyes, doubt. It was like watching a house of cards wobble in the wind. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" she pressed, her voice steady, not a hint of fear in her words. She wasn't the one who had to worry anymore. It was his move now, and that was the moment everything started to change. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, the situation hung in the air like a finely balanced tightrope. The arrival of the second squad car was a twist Veronica hadn't expected. In an instant, the red and blue lights flooded the night again, their flashing reflections throwing shadows across the barren highway. For a split second, it felt like relief. More officers meant more accountability, right? But as the second vehicle rolled to stop behind Kearns's cruiser, Veronica saw the truth unfold. This wasn't backup. This was reinforcement. The new officer who stepped out was tall, broad-shouldered, and decidedly not interested in playing by the book. He barely glanced in her direction as he strode toward Kearns, and it was then that Veronica understood what was happening. This wasn't just a rogue cop acting out. This was a partnership in arrogance. Two officers who had crossed a line and weren't going to back down. They weren't just pulling rank. They were using each other to push their boundaries, and Veronica wasn't about to let them. The new officer, who didn't even bother to introduce himself, stood silently beside Kearns, sizing her up with an almost predatory look. "Problem here?" he asked in a tone that dripped with dismissive indifference, as if Veronica were just another civilian caught in their web. For a split second, Veronica considered playing it cool, letting them think they had the upper hand. But she wasn't some victim waiting to be swallowed by the system. No, she was the FBI director, and these two had no idea who they were dealing with. The tension between the officers thickened. One of them, Kearns most likely, smirked like he knew something she didn't. But Veronica wasn't fooled. She had been in plenty of standoffs before, and this was no different. She wasn't going to let these two bullies dictate the end of her story. Veronica stood there, her hands steady by her sides, as the air between her and the officers grew thick with tension. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong anymore. No, this was something far more sinister. It was a battle for power, one where the rules no longer seemed to matter, and the line between right and wrong had been blurred beyond recognition. But Veronica was not about to let it slip through her fingers. She had fought for everything she had, her position, her career, her reputation, and she was not about to let a couple of power-hungry cops undermine it all in a single, reckless moment. The lieutenant, having arrived at the scene with his own backup, paused for a moment. His eyes swept over the situation, the officer's attention, the witness still recording it all. And for the first time, it seemed like the truth was starting to settle in. Veronica wasn't just another driver. She wasn't some civilian who could be pushed around. She was a force built on years of training, of working with the law, and of understanding how to navigate power struggles when the stakes were life or death. Director Hayes, the lieutenant began, his voice filled with the reluctant realization that the situation was about to get much bigger than anyone had anticipated. He had been briefed on her, of course, but this was a wake-up call. This was more than just an abuse of power. It was a symptom of a larger issue, a system that allowed men like Kearns to think they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Veronica straightened up, her voice cutting through the thickening silence. I want these officers detained immediately, and I want their disciplinary records pulled, full transparency. She wasn't asking for favors. She wasn't pleading for justice. She was demanding accountability. The lesson in all of this? Power could be abused, but it could also be stripped away. And Veronica Hayes? She was a reminder that the system worked when those in charge weren't afraid to make it. The world moved quickly in the aftermath of that night. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Veronica watched on the news in the quiet of her office, the video of her standoff with Officer Kearns and his partner playing out like a grim spectacle for the world to see. But for Veronica, it wasn't just about the public spectacle. It wasn't just about the humiliation Kearns would face or the media storm that would follow. It was about something much deeper, accountability. She had lived her life as a woman of action. From the moment she had been appointed FBI director, she had known that every decision she made would be scrutinized, every move watched. But what had unfolded that night was a reminder that no one was above the law, not even those who wore the badge. Justice had to work for everyone, or it worked for no one. As she sat at her desk, the papers in front of her were no longer just forms and reports. They were evidence of a system that had allowed these two officers to get away with actions that should have never been tolerated. But now, they would face consequences. The system was going to hold them accountable. The lesson Veronica had learned, and one she was determined to teach others, was simple. Justice doesn't happen by accident. It's fought for. It's something you have to protect, even when the odds seem stacked against you, even when those in power think they can act with impunity. Veronica had spent her career navigating difficult, high-stakes situations, but this was her reminder that the fight for justice isn't always about the big cases. Sometimes it's about the small moments, the ones where you stand up, alone if necessary, and demand what is right. By the time the press conference started, with Kearns and his partner under investigation, Veronica was already drafting the official report. This wasn't just one wrong stop. This was about a system that needed a change, and she was going to make sure it did.